Hey, want to get the book of Daniel plugged into Israel's history so you can kind of see what is going on chronologically and historically as you go along a timeline. When you're around 1000 before Christ, Israel was the most glorious of nations. David and Solomon ruled, and remember how great the presence of God was during their time. And over the next 400 years or so, Israel will sink into a level of morality and depravity that Ezekiel said actually makes the city of Sodom appear righteous. In Ezekiel chapter 16, there is a story of the spiritual journey and the spiritual condition of both houses of Israel, the northern kingdom as well as the southern kingdom. But this last generation, in the time of Daniel, was the ones that Ezekiel said actually made the city of Sodom appear righteous. So over a very short time, you go from the greatest of all nations to the most despicable of all nations. Well, one evening, David used his power as king. I'll say he misused his power as king, and he reached out and he touched a woman that didn't belong to him. He got this woman pregnant, and David conspired to cover up his tracks by trying to get this woman and her husband, who was a very powerful warrior in his army, to sleep together. But the husband was unwilling, so David had to have the husband killed. Well, over the next few years, the sins of David became real in the lives of his sons. And because this was a royal family, lines were drawn and sides were chosen, and the nation would erupt into civil war. And one of David's sons, Absalom, would go to war against his father. Well, in this civil war, it would last several years. I think it would take somewhere around 12 years for the wrath of God to really work its way through the house of David. In this civil war, Absalom would be killed, and the north would reunite with the south. But the fabric that held the nation together had been compromised, and within another 75 or 85 years, the nation of Israel would split into two separate nations, never, ever, ever to reunite again. So you have the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital is Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, whose capital is Jerusalem. And from, 975 or so before Christ and moving forward, you have two separate nations with two separate histories. Now, thanks to Solomon and a guy named Jeroboam, king of the north, and another guy, Ahab, idolatry made its way into the northern kingdom of Israel. And the ministries of people like Elijah and Elisha produced no long-lasting repentance. And people like Hosea and Amos, their words of warning were unheeded. Israel absolutely insisted on worshiping the other gods and following the despicable worship services that gods like Baal and Chemosh and Molech, all those worship services, they loved that more than they did the Hebrew God. In 723 before Christ, God used a nation called the rod of my anger. That's Assyria. And Assyria came in, destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. Any who survived were spread all through the Assyrian Empire, never to be heard from again. 100 or so years later, Jeremiah the prophet issued an invitation to the northern kingdom. He says, look, if you guys will just acknowledge your iniquity, I'll let you come back. But he never got a response. So from 722 before Christ and onward, you have just one nation moving forward on the timeline. The northern kingdom has been dispersed all through the empire of the Gentiles. You never hear from them again. Now, from 722 onward, you only have history in the southern kingdom of Judah. And unfortunately, as time went on, they would sink to a level of depravity that was considerably worse than the people in the north. And this is what we are looking at as we're coming on into the time frame of Daniel. Now, it gets a little bit complicated here. During the time frame of Daniel, the number one world power is no longer Assyria, it's Babylon. Babylon was a province in Assyria, but over the course of 75, 85 years, they themselves, I should say 75 or 100 years, and they themselves became very, very powerful. And they were conscripting support to try to kick the Babylonian yoke from off their neck. And they finally did it. In the time of around Daniel chapter 1, they became the strongest of all nations. And this is why you see Babylon coming in and deporting Daniel and his friends first in 606 before Christ. Several years later, 597 before Christ, they deport 10,000 Israelites and those who are capable of making weapons of war and the soldiers. And they also deport Ezekiel to Babylon. And in 586 before Christ, they come back and they smash Jerusalem, and any who survive that are deported to deported to Babylon. So here's what's important to remember. From 606 before Christ and moving forward, history is moving forward in two places. Because you're going to have Jeremiah and probably Habakkuk. I think Zephaniah is probably dead at this point. I'm not sure about that. You'll have Jeremiah remaining back in Jerusalem looking for repentance. And then you have Daniel, his friends, and Ezekiel who are out in Babylon. History's moving forward from two places. So basically, here's the flow of Old Testament history. It was a united kingdom. After David sinned with Bathsheba and the aftershocks of that, it would separate into two separate kingdoms. And around 722 before Christ, there is no more northern kingdom. History is only moving forward in the southern kingdom. And as you approach the time of Daniel, you'll see history moving forward both in Jerusalem with Jeremiah the prophet and also in Babylon with Ezekiel and Daniel and his friends. That's a lot, but that's good enough for now. And as we go into this more and more, it'll probably become clear, but just let that sink in. And I'm going to try to attach a crude timeline that I made onto this, and you can see how that lays out on a crude little time chart that I made. Talk to you guys soon, okay?